You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl with a special show on China. Chinese officials are typically prickly when it comes to Western media reports about their country. So the past few months must have been particularly uncomfortable, thanks to a slew of negative publicity that is lifting the lid on China's opaque political system. The downfall of an ambitious regional leader, Bo Xilai, amid allegations of murder and corruption, continues to make headlines. An escape by a blind rights lawyer, Chen Guangcheng, disrupted the high-level talks with the United States. The dissident artist Ai Weiwei still gives interviews. An uprising of villagers in Wukang in Guangdong province has spotlighted anger at local corruption. Officials have reacted by expelling a foreign journalist for the first time since 1998. The ruling Communist Party is also understood to be rescheduling its Congress until later this year, a possible sign of a power struggle in what is meant to be a stage-managed transition. So, what do these recent events tell us about what is happening inside China? Will the incoming leadership be more focused on reform and improving human rights? And how will China throw its growing economic and military muscle around in the world? To probe these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studios. I'm joined by Martin Jacques, author of When China Rules the World; Marta Cooper, a journalist who works at Index on Censorship; Jonas Parello-Plesner, an analyst from the European Council on Foreign Relations; and Andrew Leung, a Hong Kong-based China specialist. Perhaps I'll turn to you first in Hong Kong, Andrew. There's this story from Reuters that the top level of the Communist Party in China may be considering to delay the 5-yearly party congress. Maybe you can start by explaining to outside eyes why this is a big deal.
Well, it is certainly very, very significant. This is the first time at this rather late stage, if the story is true, that a party decides to delay this very important Congress, which is going to usher in the new leadership. This, if it's true, then this must be the outcome of several major factors. The first one is, of course, this Bo Xilai affair. Not that corruption is totally unexpected, but there are rumors that is more than just corruption and personal ambition. It's also the linkage with another member of the Politburo Standing Committee who's in charge of national security, and also connection with the Second Army Corps, which is, of course, in charge of China's missiles and nuclear weapons. So this is very, very unsettling, if true. And secondly, I think that China is feeling increasing urgency to deal with the rising middle class. China is now producing something like 7 million university graduates, and obviously the middle class is much more educated, and the time has arrived that China's middle class can no longer be governed in the same old way as they were governed before. And also internationally, there are various uncertain challenges, for example, in the South China Sea and so on and so forth.
Maybe turning to you there, Jonas, you mentioned jockeying for positions. That's something that Andrew was talking about. This is not characteristic of China, which likes to present itself as having a very ordered transition of leadership. Is that right?
Yes, I think a lot of us were expecting at the beginning of the year this would be a year of continuity, transition. Some China watchers were even starting to look what's going to happen in 2022 when the next leader's coming in. I mean, expecting this to be dull and a little bit sort of all predetermined. So in that sense, both Bo Xilai events have sort of bit surpassed that, and there is really this jockeying for position behind the scenes. I mean, it should probably also be noted that it's not just these 9 positions at the top. It's from that follows that around 60 to 70% of all the top positions are actually going to be shifted. So it is really the biggest primaries going on behind the scenes of people sort of lobbying for their position also further down in the Chinese system.
Maybe turning to you there, Martin. If 2012 was meant to be a year of continuity, what's gone wrong?
Well, I don't think actually 2012 was particularly meant to be a year of continuity. It is patently clear that the Chinese leadership are facing all sorts of new problems and new questions because basically of the country's success. But, they mean they can't carry on in the same old way. So that's clear in the 5-year plan that was adopted last year. And it's been clear in the big debate been taking place in China, barely reported actually outside China, on the future of Chinese foreign policy. I think that having said that, if, and it comes with a health warning, if it's true that the Congress has been postponed, then I think that's quite a significant moment because it suggests, I would imagine essentially the conflicts that have followed from Bo Xilai's demise mean that settling the leadership positions in particular the Standing Committee, but also the Politburo and the Central Committee, are proving more difficult and require more time.
Turning to you, Marta.
The Chinese leadership, which is currently in its most sensitive year as it undergoes transition, is really going to have to think about how it behaves. And if it continues to stifle unrest or behave in a rather opaque way, for example, by expelling reporters such as Melissa Chen, then it really is playing a dangerous game, because I think what we lack in the West is a really sort of critical and nuanced understanding of China from a historical, cultural and political perspective. And if China wants the West to understand its complexities in all its forms, then it's doing itself no favours by expelling those who go out of their way to report these complexities to the rest of the world.
One of the issues that came up from at least two or three of you was the Bo Xilai scandal, and that has obviously fed into this political jockeying for power that we've been talking about. Bo was, of course, the leader of China's biggest municipality, Chongqing. He was sacked in March and suspended from the Politburo last month, and this is all tied into the poisoning of the British businessman Neil Haywood, who Bo's wife, the businesswoman and lawyer Gu Kailai, is one of the chief suspects in that man's death. Maybe turning to you, Jonas, what are the political ramifications of this?
Bo was somewhat of a complicated political animal because he's had different positions, and actually he's been a commerce minister where he's relatively liberal. What he espoused sort of in the end, and I think what was interesting about him as a politician in China, was that he was trying a lot to sort of speak directly to people, which is basically a new type of political phenomenon in China, which you to a certain degree hadn't seen since the times of Mao, where it's much more focused now on collectivist rule. What he in Chongqing was doing was very much putting view into the and reinforcing the new left about social inequality, social housing. It was mixed with this sort of neo-Maoism about red songs and about sort of striking hard on corruption and the mafia. But I think the sort of remaining elements of his Chongqing model, as it was sometimes called, that's definitely the question of social inequality, and that will remain on the table for the next leadership. It was also something that both Hu and Wen has had part of their program, but has not really been fundamentally addressed. And social inequality in a time where China has been extremely successful economically has still been rising. So Bo was able to put his finger on that, and I think that will be his sort of lasting legacy in China, which was also, he was conscious of himself at his last press conference, where he was saying, if we're all capitalists, then we failed. He was personally probably quite hypocritical in the sense that he was enriching himself and, of course, getting his son into expensive schools abroad. So in that sense, he looked very typical of the sort of red team of princelings in China. But at the same time, he was actually occupying that new ground of new left, of pushing these ideas that there's not enough been done on social inequality, housing, which are the things that a lot of Chinese citizens are worried about.
So, Martin, the way that Bo has been politically discredited and ousted from power, is that purely because of the criminal situation around Neil Haywood and his wife, or is it also because of what he represented politically?
I think the answer's got to be both of those things. I think that Bo Xilai made many enemies. He was hugely ambitious. And he made that ambition very clear in the way that he campaigned for the seat, in effect, on the Standing Committee. And his methods in Chongqing, in some ways, did mark a return to the past, were very arbitrary. He did use torture. So I think that side of his behaviour was unacceptable. And likewise, people were concerned about his level of ambition. Although I agree with Jonas that, the lasting legacy is likely to be on the question of the importance of social equality, and interestingly, he's not been attacked on that front. In fact, that issue has been deliberately separated off from what's happened in Chongqing.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing China's opaque political system. I'm joined by Martin Jacques, author of When China Rules the World, Marta Cooper, a journalist who works at Index on Censorship, Jonas Parello-Plesner, an analyst from the European Council on Foreign Relations, and over the phone from Hong Kong by Andrew Leung, a Hong Kong-based China specialist. Andrew, turning to you there, the case of Bo Xilai has somewhat been overshadowed over the past couple of weeks by another high high-profile case, which is the one of Chen Guangcheng, a 40-year-old blind lawyer and activist who took shelter in the US embassy in Beijing for 6 days after escaping from his home village in Shandong. He fell foul of the authorities with a long campaign for farmers and disabled citizens and exposing a policy of forced abortions in Linyi in Shandong province. The situation between China and the United States over whether or not he was going to be allowed to seek refuge in the US or study there has been a bit of an embarrassment for both countries. How do you view it from Hong Kong?
I think that this is quite a bit of embarrassment for China, especially in the sense that, A, the harassment is not necessarily dictated by Beijing, but whereas there are local authorities who happen to be, they're taking the laws into their own hands. Now, normally, cases like that are not isolated, and they don't get reported. But except that this particular case, this person escaped to the American consulate. A second time, someone is using the American consulate not only as a shield, but as a kind of pivot to showcasing, the difference in the kind of laws and the kind of respectability between the two countries. And so this is hugely embarrassing for China. But having said that, though, I don't think that this is going to be a game changer in the relations between United States and China. It's quite likely that he's allowed to leave the country on study, and he himself has expressed the wish to return to China in due course. So I think that eventually this could be paved over. But again, this is another incident showing that the current method of governance may be passing its sell-by date. And what is interesting is concurring with the last Party Congress, there was a release of a 460-page World Bank report. And for the first time, the Development Research Center of the State Council has lent its name to it, suggesting that the State Council must have walked through most of the recommendations. And when I took a look at all these recommendations, they are not totally dramatic, but some of them are quite significant. For example, reform of governance and making the officials maybe more accountable, but also reform of the state-owned enterprises and dealing with the relationship between the central and the local governments. So I think that this is quite likely that the coming Party Congress is going to be the watershed, a kind of crossroads where China needs to change, and hence the coming lineup is that important. And because of all these black swans happening on the scene, and the Chinese leadership feels the need to rethink a little more.
Maybe turning to you, Jonas, is that fair that the case of Chen Guangcheng shows that the Chinese form of government is passing its sell-by date and that they're really at a crossroads now?
I would agree with that point of view, and definitely it does show, and also, as was mentioned, the sort of split between sort of local and national level. We've thought so far that the sort of national level were firmly behind this, because in human rights dialogues they would say, well, he's not in house arrest, Chen Guangcheng, and you would have people, journalists, trying to get out to him and being sort of ushered away by local authorities, which was definitely a sign that he was. And now, by sort of recognizing through this whole debacle with the US, at least giving him the right to leave, I mean, that he's not really very safe in his home province of Shandong, that sort of shows that split between the sort of local and central, and so sometimes that it's much more local authorities that take this thing into their own hand without the center necessarily controlling it. I think that shows the sort of difficulty of some of the difficulties of governance in China. And there are more and more of these. I mean, Wukan, as you mentioned earlier in the introduction, is another one, which is a certain degree a local event, but was also sort of watched nationally in China and thereby had sort of national ramifications as well.
Martin, the case of Chen Guangcheng, do you think the Chinese government are increasingly concerned about the way that they're being perceived? And how do you account for the way that they've behaved to this man? He's a blind, self-taught legal activist. They've had him under house arrest, possibly even illegal house arrest. And now he complains that they're pursuing members of his family, even sort of remote cousins.
Certainly this has been an embarrassment for the Chinese government. I think that, as Jonas has said, actually the fundamental cause of it lie at a local level in Shandong, in fact, much lower than the province of Shandong, but in the immediate area he lives in. And this is very, very common in China. I mean, I don't know why suddenly we're saying, well, there's this incident and this incident and this incident. Actually, these incidents are extremely common in China. It's just that we don't hear about them, and then suddenly the West starts discussing them, and it becomes blown up and given a huge significance, which otherwise it doesn't have if we are trying to understand where we are in China. And I want to sort of register my scepticism about crossroads. Well, there are lots of crossroads, actually, in a town, and some of them don't have great significance. So, sure, there's going to be some changes as a result of this, I would imagine, but maybe not so important. Not so important. I think the Bo Xilai case is very important because it reveals deeper divisions and conflicts within the party at a time when they've got some big questions to sort out. This question, I'm not convinced about it. Wu Qian was very interesting, but, we've had lots of those. I mean, this is not new. This is part of what happens in China. Now, what might happen as a result of this is that maybe there'll be the reassertion of more of a sort of rule of law. Maybe there will be. Maybe some of these things will be straightened out. That's what I would hope. And clearly when Wen Jiabao, the end of the People's Congress, said, in response to the situation in Chongqing and his criticism of clearly Bo Xilai was, we need to move in the direction of political reform and also legal reform. So maybe that will happen. But one thing I want to emphasize in all this, and that is there is a very strong Western tendency to interpret any incidents like this that happen in China as the fragility of the leadership. This is an illusion. It is not true. The Chinese government is very strong. It's got problems, it's got serious conflicts, but this is a government that enjoys huge popular support.
You say that these particular incidents, the ones we've been talking about, Bo Xilai and Chen Guangcheng and Ai Weiwei and the Wukan uprising, have attracted headlines over here. Why do you think we're picking up on these particular cases and more recently, for example, in the past 12 months, have become quite focused on them when you say that what's going on in China, this is all just business as usual?
Part of the Western paradigm towards China is about dissidents and the lack of human rights and so on. Now, I'm not saying that isn't a problem in relationship to China. And certainly through a Western lens, it is a problem vis-à-vis China. But it's only part of a much bigger and much more complicated picture. And one of the things we can't understand vis-à-vis China is if we only understand the problem of governments through human rights issues.
I think it's right. I mean, what Martin is saying is there's 180,000 protests a year. So, I mean, lots of this is happening at local level. I think, though, what changed, though, in the last couple of years has been the way Chinese public discussion on these things, particularly fueled through Chinese blogs. I mean, they're being censored, but still they're evading censorship. So we have discussions about Ai Weiwei, about Wukan. So the fact that some of these local incidents take on a national significance and take part in the national debate, I think that's probably the big difference in what's happening, where before they were precisely that, small, local, isolated cases, and there are many of them. So when you looked at it and you say, okay, this could potentially be very difficult for China's government model, but hasn't been. And I think the difference now is just that these cases now also inside the Chinese debate, not just by us, are actually also part of their discussion of where the country is going.
Much more significant than the Chen issue, although I think that has a significance of its own, was what happened in 2010 and 2011 in Guangdong province, when there were a wave of very, very large-scale strikes taking place, in which migrant workers were involved in a completely new way, in which previously totally ineffective labour unions were mobilised, and which resulted in very big increases in the minimum wage in the first instance in Guangdong, but then subsequently in most major cities in China, including Beijing and Shanghai. Now, that was of a very large scale, and it had all sorts of implications for the Chinese, not least it's actually resulted in a big increase in the standard of living of a lot of those workers.
This is the Voice of Russia. The London Bureau of the Voice of Russia is now live on digital radio and online, with news, comment and debate on weekdays between 4 and 7 p.m.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing China's opaque political system. I'm joined by Martin Jacques, author of When China Rules the World, Marta Cooper, a journalist who works at Index on Censorship, Jonas Parello-Plesner, an analyst from the European Council on Foreign Relations, and over the phone from Hong Kong by Andrew Leung, a Hong Kong-based China specialist. Marta, I'd like to bring you in here because you must have a perspective, working as you do for the Index on Censorship, on media and media freedoms in China, and whether or not what Jonas was saying is true, which is that there's a lot more national attention being given to these local situations. And maybe you can suggest what the implications of that are.
Last time I checked, there are around 300 million registered microbloggers in China using Sina Weibo, which is the Chinese version of Twitter, and China has about 500 million internet users, so that those just some figures that give you an idea of how Chinese authorities also need to use Web 2.0 for gauging or perhaps monitoring public opinion, and how netizens are perhaps playing a more supervisory role in Chinese politics. It's difficult to predict the implications of this. What I will say is that Chinese authorities know that they can't control these microbloggers, who are often one step ahead of the censors, but they are certainly working hard to do that. And microbloggers and netizens all around, okay, they're not necessarily discussing solely local issues or issues of unrest or political divisions, but they are raising more attention to these local issues. And I think this is something that we certainly need to keep an eye on.
Maybe I'll turn over to you, Andrew, in Hong Kong, maybe for a bit more of a local perspective. I was really interested in what Martin was saying before about the way that it's almost pointless to try and understand China from a Western or human rights point of view, and that really we should be trying to understand it from its own internal narrative. Do you think that's fair?
That's the reason why most countries have been misreading China in one way or another. But I think what the present situation has revealed is that the current leadership is keenly aware of this huge community, the Weibo, the microbloggers, and the rising middle class. And it's not only in China, but across the world. I mean, look at the Arab Spring. It's a rising tide of the middle class, ordinary citizens with their own opinions, with their own aspirations. And that's the reason why I said that the old style of governance can no longer be sustained. And China needs to wise up to that and to respond to some of these aspirations. And look at this very major incident in Wuhan. The leader of this change is no less a person than someone who is likely to be elevated to the Politburo Standing Committee. And he is really changing the existing arrangement, a very high profile way. But if he was bidding for a seat in the top Politburo Standing Committee, he's unlikely to do this without some sort of understanding that this is the way to deal with it. And in fact, that he said that he's going to roll it out, at least in Guangdong, the Wuhan model. Now, if this is true, then even though these are village elections, if all village elections are going to be fair and open and properly supervised and properly democratic, well, that would be a huge change for China, because don't forget, these villages cover something like half of China's population. So I think the number of changes are afoot. But when I said crossroads, I certainly do not mean regime change. There's no way that China would copy the Western model. In fact, the Western model democracy has shown some sort of stress. Look at what's happening on Capitol Hill, and some of the kind of political arguments are tending to be dysfunctional. So China is going on its own path to find its own way towards democracy. But I think that this coming party congress is going to be a game changer.
Martin, do you take any issue with anything that he was saying there? Because Andrew said that the old style of governance in China cannot be sustained anymore, whereas you were presenting the idea that the Chinese government and leadership is strong, confident and popular.
I essentially agree with what Andrew said. I mean, the thing is that just because the basic contours of the regime have not changed over the last 30 years doesn't mean there haven't been great changes. This is an illusion. This is, to be quite frank, based on Western ignorance about China. I mean, often Deng Xiaoping's reforms were described as simply economic reform and no political reforms in the West. This was absolute nonsense. I mean, Deng Xiaoping completely reconstructed the Chinese state. And there have been waves of state reform in China. It's just that they don't accord to what our expectation or aspiration should be for China. That doesn't mean it's not reforming. And so Andrew's correct. Of course, as a result of the Bo Xilai case and as a result of maybe of Chen's case, or all the great changes, I mean, huge changes that are taking place in China that are invisible in relation to this discussion. These are pressing for reforms so that there is a greater, a more rule-based, norm-based, law-based society. This is a major pressure in China, and it will happen. And you can see it happening in lots of ways. The leadership is being obliged to become more responsive to the situation. I mean, when you had the high-speed rail accident in Wenzhou, the initial reaction was to, by the Ministry of Railways was to brush it under the carpet. In fact, it didn't. It couldn't be brushed under the carpet, partly for what Marta's saying, all the microblogging and so on. It was right across the newspapers. I was in China at the time, and there was a huge discussion in civil society going on, which the Communist Party will respond to. So I think that we will see changes, but I agree with Andrew that we're not talking about regime change. And anyway, if you look around the world at the moment, not least in the Western countries, there is a crisis of governance. So, democracy doesn't look so attractive, Western democracy, to the Chinese, but that is not going to be the issue. The question of growing accountability, growing representativity, growing transparency in China, but they'll do it their own way.
Marta, I'll bring you in there. Is that right? Have we been misreading China? And what is the right way to read China? And what can we expect from the way that it behaves over the coming years?
As I said earlier, it's very wrong to predict how China will behave. Anyone who's been there would know that it's impossible to do so. But what I will say is that it's very important to see China as a very paradoxical place. And just to echo Martin's point and the points that Andrew made as well, it is questionable how the sustainability of China as it deals with new societal forces in an old way. It's very important to stress that under this sort of same basic infrastructure of control that's existed since 1949, the Communist Party is wrestling with a growing middle class that has a greater awareness of legal and human rights, as well as the government's responsibility to them. They have a far wider access to information and ways of engaging in public debate than they ever had before. But it's also important to remember that this perhaps appetite for change, if you could call it that, or for at least slight reforms, hasn't existed without changes instigated by the government as well. I mean, the growth that we've seen in China, the incredible growth, has brought wealth to more people in a shorter space of time than ever before. And naturally, this would breed sentiments of loyalty and nationalism, and that just echoes Martin's point that there is support for the Communist Party as well. But so it's important to see those two things together, and it's in China it will never be one or the other. And so I think a more nuanced and critical understanding of these paradoxes within China would really benefit the West.
Would anybody like to gaze into their crystal ball and suggest how all these tensions, these paradoxes are going to be resolved?
Well, one final point I'd like to add is that when Deng Xiaoping came up with the reform in 1978, he was referring to the phrase, letting a few people get rich first. Now, certainly, this is no longer sustainable, as we are seeing a huge economic divide between the haves and the have-nots, and China's Gini coefficient is one of the world's sort of highest, and this leads to a lot of social instability. So what China is trying to do, both in the 12 five-year plan and it's likely even in the World Bank report, which I referred to, is to create a more balanced economy, a more balanced society, so that it's not skewed, towards only the money grabbers and vested interests, and to pay more attention to the underprivileged, to those the people who are poor, who are destitute, who do not have access to healthcare, education, and so on and so forth. To create if not a totally harmonious society, at least a more balanced kind of society and economy.
That was Andrew Leung, a Hong Kong-based China specialist, saying that the future for China could be to offer less support to the money grabbers and create a fairer and more balanced society. I was also joined by Martin Jacques, author of When China Rules the World, Marta Cooper, a journalist who works at Index on Censorship, and Jonas Parello-Plesner, an analyst from the European Council on Foreign Relations. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest update on world news.